Sunday Morning Live. Are the media stirring up hatred of Muslims? On Saturday morning, the 7th of July 2012, I had a telephone call from and short conversation with Simon Darby, asking me if I would be happy to go on air for the BBC Sunday Morning Live show the following morning, Sunday, to discuss their question of whether the media were stirring up hatred of Muslims. Knowing what these kinds of shows are like, I was more than happy to oblige. Apparently, I had been especially asked for by name, as one who seemed to know what he was talking about. I was somewhat surprised and gratified by that, especially coming, as it did, from the BBC. You never have much time to prepare for things like this, and when you do get on such shows, in this case by telephone link rather than in person, you must never hog the show, and you only get a short time to put your case. You cannot afford to get sidetracked by irrelevant issues or unimportant details. My job was to wait on the end of a telephone, listen attentively to how the debate, or argument in this case, was going, and then answer the questions put to me as briefly and as accurately as I could. I was not there to interact as such with the three members of the panel and with the chairwoman, Shamira Ahmed. The three panel members were Dame Anne Leslie, a journalist from the Mail, Mohammed Shafiq, a Muslim worker in public relations, and Simon Hill, a spokesman for the somewhat leftish and globalist think tank Ecclesia. So there were two Muslims, a spokesman left of left, and a journalist who had to be of an anti-BNP slant by the rules of her trade union. As you know, trade unions, the journalist trade unions, don't allow their journalists, rather, to speak well of the BNP. So it was perhaps a tilted show. Apparently, Muslims are, according to research by a Muslim foundation, known as Tell Mama Helpline, and run by Fiaz Mughal, MBE, Muslims, especially women Muslims, are being subjected to attacks by persons who have sympathy with the English Defence League and, to a much lesser degree, with the British National Party. On the latter point, that could include up to 1 million people who voted for the British National Party in the 2009 European Union elections, and many more who considered doing that but in the end either did not vote or voted for the three mainstream parties, if we may call them that. The assumption put by the pleasant, rather attractive and highly westernised presenter, Shamira, was that this was either due to racism or Islamophobia. I appreciate she was doing her job as her bosses had told her, or it was due to the media stirring up hatred of all Muslims. One example put from the Muslim investigative group that had done research into this matter was that such assailants, often youngish white males, Britons, were targeting lone Muslim females in distinctive Islamic dress such as the hijab or the burqa. They were, or so it was alleged, verbally abusing Muslim ladies and pulling down their face dresses, their face masks. I was then brought on to explain the position of the BNP. I said what I considered to be the position of the British National Party, bearing in mind that I am a member of that party, one of its religious affairs spokesmen, and a former councillor of that party and a candidate for that party in several elections. I first had to put out that Islam is a religion and not a race, which seemed to have passed everyone by, and rather shows the distorted perspective that media folk can have on the whole issue, notwithstanding how obvious this point is. Even from their own viewpoint, the people who were being apparently attacked, or at least verbally abused, were Muslim women who tended to wear distinctive Islamic dress. Their men usually do not. This tends to bear out the view that the attacks are, if anything, motivated on the grounds of religious and not racial identity. So, the suggestion that the attacks or incidents of verbal abuse are racially motivated is an oxymoron, yet it was constantly repeated. Sikh men have often a distinctive dress, yet they are not being verbally abused in the streets. So we have to accept that the issue is one of religion, the religion of Islam, and not the race of what many of its adherents may be in this country. I could not make all these points on the show, but that is what I would like to have said had I gotten the time. I then added that if people have got issues with Islam, we in the BNP would not support, endorse or encourage a violent, criminal or personally abusive response to these issues or to Muslims, and that the British National Party is in favour rather of educating the population generally about the true nature of Islam, and arguing properly and therefore politically and organising politically to stop the Islamification of Britain, which is one of our greatest dangers. None of the panellists seemed to get this or to agree with what I said, including, amazingly enough, even the lady journalist from the Daily Mail. A second point was then put to me about a Muslim girl, Nurjahan Katan, who had been physically attacked by a gang of about 7 young men and had been left in a distressed state, but had otherwise not been harmed. I made the obvious point that we, as a party, are not in favour of crime, and again that the problem of Islam has to be dealt with politically, rather than in the way that some members of the EDL or certain other people have been doing, even though they have seen the danger of Islam, though they may not be reacting to it in the political way that they should. And that was my contribution. What follows is briefly what I would like to have said had I had the time and the opportunity. A preliminary issue is that we in the British National Party tend to get picked on for all kinds of things not related to us, and yet we are not given the time to explain what really is wrong. Instead, those who are given rather too much time to give their views do not understand what is wrong and otherwise display their lack of understanding of the issues, for example by raising the race issue, when it is palpably not about race. The problem, it seems to me, is Islam itself. It is the most violent religion on earth, though it tends, like Machiavelli, who was not a Muslim, to rely on the threat of force and on hidden or non-publicised force, since, as Machiavelli understood it, a reputation for such methods can be self-defeating, especially where the Muslims are not yet in the majority. Islam is a carefully orchestrated movement or series of movements, which tends to rely even more upon deception, covering up its violent side than it does even on its own very violent principles, if that is the best or the only way to further its agenda of conquest by stealth and cumulative domination by a combination of force with deception. Islam, however, will use violence, and indeed can revel in it, where it feels that it can progress its cause thereby, and where it feels that it can get away with it. It has done so for at least 30 years in politically correct Britain, where Muslim men wage Quranic jihad against the targeted populations, vulnerable women and young girls. The Muslim communities under the Quran and the teaching of Muhammad have harboured and given succour to this. It has involved serious sexual abuse, rape and deaths, and not just verbal abuse, however distressing that is to the individual victim concerned. That is why we have had the Pedostani trials and convictions in our northern cities. The truth has eventually come out, thanks very much to courageous citizens and to the BNP, not the media, though Muslim propagandists, ill-informed or prejudiced left-wingers, and irresponsible or misinformed right-wing journalists have either sought to cover up the crisis or have not seen its true nature. The specially chosen panel that morning fairly represented each strand of such misconception and misinformation. Yet it is sad that it has come to this, but it is very likely to get a lot worse, not because we in the BNP want it to get any worse, and there is thus no good reason to try to scapegoat the British National Party for this sad and worsening state of affairs, but because in allowing the situation to develop to the size that it has, the mainstream parties, that is, it will take a massive effort and some time to turn it around. But we must be clear on the problem, the originating problem, and not on some of the symptoms, which, though being problems in themselves, leading to other problems, such as the verbal abuse of Muslim women, are only part of a chain of causation arising from the dominating presence of this extremely violent and chameleon-like religion in Britain. To say such is not to be Islamophobic, as I am going to point out, because we must ask ourselves the question, in the meantime, where do Muslim women go for safety? Where do Muslim women go for safety? If they stay in their own communities for their own protection, they may fall foul of the discriminatory Sharia courts endorsed by Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams no less, which treat Muslim women as worth only half the value of their men. Now I, as a truly ordained man of the cloth, cannot go along with that. As a truly ordained man of the cloth, this is not something that I could commend. If they stay in their homes with their kin, they may be married off to some stranger in Pakistan, and if they step out of line with their parents, uncles or brothers, they may have to endure the ultimate sacrifice of an honour killing. How many honour murders of Muslim women have we had in this country so far that we know of? It is at least 1,500. You cannot blame the EDL for that, can you? Nor should we seek to excuse this violence to Muslim women on the basis of culture, for it comes from the Quran and the teachings and doings of Muhammad. In any case, we must apply one standard. If Islam is violent to those on the outside, it is even more violent to those on its inside. Joining a protection racket is not an option. Out of the frying pan and into the fire, I say to any contemplating the appeasement of this monster in our midst. Islamophobic? Not a bit. If the Muslim women flee to the Muslim world, the Dar al-Islam, the abode or zone of submission, they will experience even more of what submission means. In Saudi Arabia, the Muslim girls can be whipped, stoned to death, or beheaded for stepping out of line, and their testimony is worth only half that of a man, if that. If they go to moderate Pakistan, they could even be given life imprisonment under the Pakistan Penal Code for murmuring against the Quran, and they could get the death penalty for squeaking against Muhammad. I am surprised that Fiaz Mughal, MBE, and his research group has not highlighted any of these things to protect Muslim women, and that, at this point, Mohammed Shafiq's ethical and moral stance on reporting facts, as he puts it, is here noticeably shy of them. I cannot endorse, support, or encourage the verbal abuse of Mohammedan women by the EDL or anyone else for that matter. But neither can I close my mind to Pedostani attacks, murder and rape on our women and girls, nor can I close my heart or mind to the Sharia abuse of Muslim women and men within their highly orchestrated communities, either here in what the Muslims call the abode of war, or abroad, in Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, which they portray and imagine to be the abode of peace. Islam split India in a bloodbath in 1947. We must ensure, if at all we can, that nothing like that ever happens here. The Apostle John tells us that the Son of God was manifested, that he might destroy the works of the devil. First Epistle of John, chapter 3 and verse 8. The Christian must love the Muslim and the member of the EDL. But that does not mean that we should put out our eyes as to the nature of what this religion is when it is seen in the Mass. We must pray that the true nature of Islam shall be exposed, and that its first victims, the Muslims themselves, Muslim women, both men and women, shall come to be delivered out of it, and that we too may be saved from its paws. Sunday Morning Live. Are the media stirring up hatred of Muslims? On Saturday morning, the 7th of July 2012, I had a telephone call from and short conversation with Simon Darby, asking me if I would be happy to go on air for the BBC Sunday Morning Live show the following morning, Sunday, to discuss their question of whether the media were stirring up hatred of Muslims, of an anti-BNP slant, by the rules of her trade union. As you know, trade unions, the journalist trade unions, don't allow their journalists, rather, to speak well of the BNP. So it was perhaps a tilted show. Apparently, Muslims are, according to research by a Muslim foundation, known as Tell Mama Helpline, other than in person, you must never hog the show, and you only get a short time to put your case. You cannot afford to get sidetracked by irrelevant issues or unimportant details. My job was to wait on the end of a telephone, listen attentively to how the debate, or argument in this case, was going, and then answer the questions put to me as briefly and as accurately as I could. I was not there to knowing what these kinds of shows are like, I was more than happy to oblige. Apparently, I had been especially asked for by name, as one who seemed to know what he was talking about. I was somewhat surprised and gratified by that, especially coming, as it did, from the BBC. You never have much time to prepare for things like this, and when you do get on such shows, in this case by telephone link, rather interact as such with the three members of the panel and with the chairwoman, Shamira Ahmed. The three panel members were Dame Anne Leslie, a journalist from the Mail, Mohammed Shafiq, a Muslim worker in public relations, and Simon Hill, a spokesman for the somewhat leftish and globalist think tank Ecclesia. So there were two Muslims, a spokesman left of left, and a journalist who had to be